Hello and welcome to J&B Talk F1 this week, Wednesday the 26th of August. I'm Jawad Yakub, as always, joining me Baden Westerweller. And before we get into proceedings today, we'd like to extend our deepest condolences to the family and friends of Indycar racer and former F1 driver Justin Wilson, who tragically succumbed to his injuries sustained at an Indycar event a few days ago. And it's just a tragic loss for motorsport as a whole, so we'll talk a bit about that later. Before that, we're going to discuss the Belgian Grand Prix, which was run and done over the weekend, won by Lewis Hamilton. Do a wrap-up of the race and a bit of analysis. Then we'll get into the most recent tyre debacle surrounding Pirelli, as well as looking at the Enstone team, Lotus F1's future, and whether Renault will come over and save them. So, Baden, how are you today?
Yeah, well, it's good to be here again. Naturally, it's with heavy hearts for both of us. Any tragedy is always one which strikes to the core of a motorsport fan, but this one especially as well. He did have that past connection to Formula One, albeit over a decade ago, and it's just considering how raw everybody is in light of Jules Bianchi's passing a little over a month ago. This has come quite hot on the heels, so it's just another real dagger in the hearts of many, really, and it puts everything once again into perspective.
Indeed, and the whole Formula One community, as well as the motorsport community as a whole, has been quite supportive of what has happened. But anyway, we'll discuss that a little bit later in regards to another topic. But Lewis Hamilton achieved his 6th win of the season, with Nico Rosberg finishing second. And in the end, I guess what we can say was that as much as we were building up for an exciting race, it was a bit of a fizzer, wasn't it?
The entire weekend, to be honest, after all the highs and the conjecture after Britain and then to a larger degree Hungary, we were all expecting some kind of a real chaos, you could say, not least on the first lap, but just generally we might have been seeing a new pecking order there. But lights out, the Mercedes led from the word go, and that was all she said.
Indeed, and the new starting procedure, as we discussed on our Sunday podcast, didn't really have much of an effect on the front-running cars. We saw Nico Rosberg, however, drop a few places, allowing Daniel Ricciardo and Sergio Perez to get up there onto the podium places, but Lewis Hamilton pretty much led from the word go and maintained a lead even when Rosberg made his way back into second. Nevertheless, there was an aborted start due to Nico Hülkenberg having a problem. He formed up on the grid and started waving his hands, and then he and Carlos Sainz ended up starting from the pit lane, but that didn't really help their cause as they retired a few laps later, as did Pastor Maldonado. More bad luck for the Venezuelan, retiring with an engine problem on the second lap of the race. Then we come to the first phase of pit stops around lap 8 time, and Daniel Ricciardo in a closely contested battle with Sergio Perez for third at the moment, and Ricciardo ends up pitting a lap early and benefits on the undercut over Perez, so that was good to see from the Australian. Then later on, there was a bizarre pit... Sorry, Baden, what was that?
I was just going to say, especially coming on the heels of last year in Hungary, we were getting quite high in our expectations there that we might see Ricciardo on the podium again. So what culminated not too far down the track from here, it was a bit of a disappointment.
Yes, exactly. Red Bull had hoped for a podium finish for Ricciardo, but lap 21 he retires due to a hydraulics issue, which is believed. But yeah, a very disappointing race for Ricciardo. But not the least for Danny Kvyat, his teammate, who ended up finishing 4th, kept his head clear of the dramas that occurred towards the end of the race. But going back to early on in the race, there was a bizarre pit stop for Valtteri Bottas where just everyone was laughing at what had happened. The team had ended up putting soft tyres on the front and medium tyres on the rear. So, but as laughable as that is, it is a bit of a, it does ponder the question what was going on there at the time, and as a result, Bottas was handed a drive-through penalty, and that pretty much wrecked his race from there.
You have to admit as well, Williams now on the heels of Britain, where they had a 1-2 and at least if not one car on the podium, two cars on the podium. They came away essentially empty-handed. Then their real write-off of a weekend at Hungary, and now this little mess up in the pit stops. They've had a few interesting shake-your-head moments of late, and they've really not capitalised on not quite a car that's been as handy as it was in 2014, but they've had the opportunities there to really be in the front-running pack, and for whatever reason, they've just let it go wanting each time.
Indeed, and this was a circuit that we said prior to the weekend that would suit Williams' characteristics, and in the end, it was the pit stop gaffe is what spoiled Bottas's race. He finished 9th, scoring 2 points, and then Felipe Massa, after a bad start, he only ended up finishing 6th, the position he started, and it wasn't much points for Williams there, but they did end up getting more points than Ferrari on the day. Ferrari will talk a bit about that later. But yes, going back to now to Romain Grosjean, who started 9th after a gearbox penalty. He would have started 4th, but he was making some moves on Sergio Perez into Lake Coombe and ended up in contention for the podium versus Sebastian Vettel, who was on a one-stop strategy trying to do something contrary to what the rest of the pack was doing, and this is what happened. On the penultimate lap, we saw Vettel's right rear tyre explode on the Kemmel Straight in rather spectacular fashion, and after that, Pirelli came under great scrutiny for what had occurred, and as a result, Vettel ended up finishing 12th, and he was fine. There was no accidents or whatever. Romain Grosjean inherited the podium, which we'll talk about in a bit of a second, but again, Pirelli, another tyre blowout this weekend. First, we said it was Nico Rosberg during practice, where the tyre just, the thread came loose and pretty much just came loose throughout the lap and eventually let go. Pirelli, what's going on?
Well, it's come at an interesting time with the tender rights for the 2017 and beyond, with Michelin raising their hand to maybe re-enter the sport from that season, and Pirelli, they obviously had their real crisis point going back to 2013 at Silverstone, when everything came to a head with those spectacular failures on almost a third of the grid ended up suffering in some shape or another, and it seemed to have died down in recent years. They'd gone very conservative, but the last really few races, you can say there's been a few different concerns, and that has culminated this weekend with a really, it wasn't as captured as widely, obviously, being practiced for Nico Rosberg, but that on the back straight was equally as fearful to lay eyes on. And then we saw Sebastian Vettel. It looks spectacular, yes, and there's a lot of debate as well around his strategy. He'd been running, was it 27 or 28 laps at the time? So this is a factor that has to be laid into the equation. Nevertheless, for Pirelli, it does reopen this debate, which has been simmering for really pretty much their entire tenure in the sport.
Indeed. More on that in a few minutes' time, but we'll look at some great battles that we saw between Max Verstappen and Felipe Nasser, albeit this was whilst they were outside of the points, but the Dutch teenager, being Belgian-born, he was racing wheel-to-wheel with the Sauber of Nasser through Blanchimont and into the bus stop chicane, and we keep praising how this kid can overtake, and he's showing a lot of raw talent this year so far in his debut year.
Yeah, well, it's also his quasi-home event, you could call it. He was, after all, born within the Belgian prefecture, you could call it, and he's come a long way throughout this season. He's had his moments where he hasn't quite executed right. You need to look at Monaco for the most prevalent example there, and that ended up was ugly, but he got away with it. But other than that, he's really turned a lot of heads throughout the season, and he's only going to develop from here. But we got a small taste once again on a Sunday. Even if he did over-execute on that penultimate lap, costing him that position, he's very exciting and just what Formula One needs.
Indeed, and he started from 18th on the grid and ended up finishing 8th, so some points for Verstappen after his 4th place in Hungary. the Sauber teammate of Nasser, Marcus Ericsson, ended up taking the final point, and I guess was probably the most underrated driver of the day. He started 13th, but ran pretty much a clean race, kept his head out of trouble, and ended up 10th, which is crucial for Sauber down there, who brought some upgrades with their Ferrari engine this weekend to the Belgian Grand Prix, and he ended up beating his teammate, who ruled pretty much a perennial brake issue that his car has been suffering for the last few races. So I wonder if Sauber are going to look into that and fix that for Felipe Nasser. But regardless, Nasser outside of the points in 11th. We'll go down to McLaren when Jenson Button after the race pretty much said that this was one of the most embarrassing races he's had, which included problems with the hybrid system, which have been chiefly prevalent with the new Honda unit, and also a hit that he had with Will Stevens at the start of the race, which wasn't shown on television, but Button alluded to it in a radio communique with his team. So what's going on with McLaren? They said that they were going to be on par with Ferrari this weekend in terms of their power unit, but finishing 13th and 14th and just ahead of the Mana Marushas.
Yeah, all talk for no outcome, really. There was a lot of hope within the Woking campaign over in Japan that these upgrades were going to really bring them back to the forefront, and if anything, they've almost stagnated or gone backwards on it. What was arguably a lucky breakthrough at Hungary. Nevertheless, they've really not made any inroads, which have been sizable, and you've got to wonder now for the rest of the season whether they just need to pretty much just put all their resources towards the 2016 Challenger, because it's taken 11 races now, and it just seems as though every weekend's a pause, rewind, fast forward motion of engine penalties, start at the rear, and then get entangled in some kind of scrap with the so-called back markers, and it's just nothing seems to improve here.
Even taking all these penalties and what have you, and bringing two upgraded power units per driver to this weekend, we haven't seen them, gain any tenths or seconds or what have you. So could it be just down to the fact that the Honda unit is weak on the high speed circuits, or is it just that they're not moving forward? But we'll probably look at that when it comes to the Italian Grand Prix Monza, another high-speed circuit with the highest speeds on the calendar, and we'll see what the progress is there. But regardless of that, Roberto Merri then outraced his teammate Will Stevens. Stevens, as said before, suffered from the run-in with Jenson Button at the start of the race, but Lewis Hamilton now 28-point lead over his teammate Nico Rosberg. More than a race win's worth now, and again, Rosberg, a bit of a no-show at Belgium. Would you agree there or disagree?
I do wonder whether this impending birth of his first child could have been weighing quite heavily on his mind. Of course, this newborn is due any time now, they're saying, so this week. So by the time we reach Monza in about 10 days' time, he will be a father, and whether this will release some weight off his shoulders. And of course, we can't dismiss what he happened on a Friday with that blowout, whether that did affect his confidence somewhat. It'd be remiss not to consider the drivers, even though they do look like tough on the exterior. These kind of outcomes can really mess with your mind, not least at a circuit as vaunted as Belgium.
Exactly, and back with Lewis Hamilton, he's sort of got the monkey off the back. He's had 3 pole positions at this circuit, but only remarkably 1 victory, and now that's 2 victories. So the hoodoo has lifted itself, and then Romain Grosjean, despite in a sense inheriting the podium from Sebastian Vettel, he had good pace throughout the race and perhaps could have closed in on Vettel if there was a few more laps in the race with those fresher tyres. But this is the first podium for Lotus and for Grosjean since the 2013 United States Grand Prix. So, I mean, we've talked about how the Lotus car this season has the potential of being up there, top 5 or top 6 places. But this is the first time we've seen, a delivery of that, and we found out over the weekend, as we'll discuss later on when we talk about Lotus's future, that this is the first weekend that this is the first weekend in a while that the team have actually brought upgrades with them. So thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, obviously, it is the irony now that what could transpire for the rest of their campaign if they do end up perhaps not racing out of Italy and beyond, for them to pretty much end their campaign with a podium. It's a shame in a way that they finally realised that potential, which had been so latent since the pre-season, in contrast to their forgetful 2014 campaign, of course, with the Mercedes power there. That's brought them a long way forward, and Pastor Maldonado, conversely, has been not able to make the most of his package this year for one reason or another. But for Grosjean, he's someone who's been very patient. We've seen his frustrations, not just this year, pretty much the last couple of seasons now. So it was certainly something that he was worthy of, and it's just whether now he'll be on the grid in a couple of weeks' time.
Indeed, and we'll discuss the bailiffs, of course, when we get to that, the bailiff issue surrounding the Lotus team. But yeah, so who would you say would have been the driver of the day? My thoughts are firmly with Romain Grosjean, who drove spectacularly, kept his head out of trouble, and in the end is reaping the benefit of a podium.
And also an honourable mention, you'd have to say, to Sergio Perez, who kept his nose clean, and he was in contention in those early stages for that third position. Of course, Force India's got quite a proud history throughout their various iterations here, so clearly coming into its own again was the VJM08, and for him to take up a few more solid points, it's quite crucial in the context of the constructors. But of course, you'd have to say Grosjean pips him on that post.
That's very good, and we've wrapped up the Belgian Grand Prix then. We can't wait to get back and preview the Italian Grand Prix, another historic event next week for you. But now going back to the tragedy that occurred during the week with Justin Wilson and IndyCar, and this has reopened the debate, if you'd like to say, about regarding closed cockpits and canopies for open wheelers. Now, how do you feel regarding this? And this is the FIA, and Charlie Whiting, the race director for Formula One, has come out and said that this needs to be looked at again.
This has been on the table now for many years. It's been accentuated quite naturally by the events of 10 months ago, Suzuka, the tragic events which ultimately claimed last month Jules Bianchi's life, and now tragically again, the almost freakish circumstances equally as Bianchi's were, that this debris has hit Wilson on the head from the nose cone, and you wouldn't have imagined it in any other circumstance. Even if he had just run into the wall himself, you see drivers more often not come away unharmed, but it remains the question there. These occurrences can happen from time to time. We've now seen, not even in F1, you just got to look across the board, all sorts of sports. There's just these freak occurrences which have taken place quite commonly now in the past 12 months, and specifically for these open wheelers. It's always going to be that question which lingers, and they've just got to make sure, if it ever does come to pass, that the canopy concept is brought to motion, they execute it right. There are all sorts of safety concerns almost in that front, not least, how does a driver get out in the event that they've perhaps crashed and there's some kind of fire hazard? Who knows?
Indeed, this was brought to light by the jet fighter style cockpit design, where they would have the jet fighter style cover on top of the cockpit, and indeed, what if there was a fire hazard, or perhaps even the car rolls? How does the driver get out in that the mandatory allocated time? There is a given time that a driver must get out of his car in lieu of an emergency. So, with a bit more research, yes, with a bit more research. Yes, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, it's again once more time for introspection for all these open wheel categories, and they're just really going to make sure if it is done, it's just done right.
Indeed, and would you say that it has to be done across the board, or perhaps one category must be looked at more than another? Say, perhaps IndyCar gets more focus than perhaps Formula One.
You'd have to say that IndyCar would be the number one priority to pioneer this concept, just because of the pure nature of the oval races, which really do present the most hazards. And then if that can be successfully adopted in perhaps a year or two, then there's a logic in it for Formula One and the other lower categories to adopt the concept.
And indeed, before we wrap up as well, Charlie Whiting had this quote too, what he said, that F1 must forget about tradition and look to adopting this sort of thing. So safety comes first over tradition in that regard. But indeed, very sad thing to hear. Just not even a month after the passing of Jules Bianchi for Formula One, and Justin Wilson, Indycar driver, much loved by everyone, tragically succumbing to his injuries. But moving it on now to the Pirelli tyre debacle that we discussed earlier, and the tyre supply back under scrutiny after Rosberg's blowout in free practice 2, and then Sebastian Vettel during the race. Now Pirelli blame Ferrari for choosing the one-stop strategy and going beyond the recommended wear life of the tyre. The normal wear life of the tyre is 40 laps, the medium compound tyre, but because of the conditions, Pirelli said that 40 laps could not be achieved, and 28 laps even was too much. And as I said here, the unusually high temperatures have affected the tyre behaviour all weekend, and regardless, Vettel was quite vocal post-race about the safety risks and how perhaps, if he had the blowout going up by Rouge, he'd be in hospital or something and not being able to give interviews. So some strong views from Sebastian Vettel there. How do you view this then?
Well, naturally, any driver who's been through that ordeal is going to be hot under the collar, and we saw that quite evidently immediately after the race when he had that I wouldn't say guaranteed third position, but he was doing his best to hold off a fast-charging Romain Grosjean there, and naturally as well, it's seen his perhaps outside chance of making a run for that title bid slipped through the door now. He's well out of contention, but you do have to weigh it up, as we mentioned earlier with Ferrari. They did run a long strategy there, despite the real warnings from Pirelli there, and nevertheless, we've seen the history the Italian mark has in Pirelli, that is, that they've had these issues, and it causes a lot of consternation. And this one just highlights once again the fraught nature of F1 cars and the tyres.
But would you say that if the conditions were different, say the temperatures were not as warm as it would be, we'd be looking at this differently? Is that probably the mindset that Ferrari had when putting Vettel onto this strategy?
Well, what is interesting, when we do look throughout this campaign to date, Ferrari have been quite strong in these warmer conditions. You only have to look at Malaysia, and then of course Hungary was quite warm there, and they triumphed once again. So they were probably thinking almost along the lines that it's surely, once again, they'll be right to get to the line. So in that sense, you can understand their anger that things haven't worked out for them. But who knows? On any given day, any set of tyres, there's a chance that it could be a set which is weaker than another one, and we saw what happened on Sunday.
And Nico Rosberg as well, who had his moment in free practice 2, saying after the race that the tyres need to be addressed and looked at by Pirelli before the Italian Grand Prix next week at Monza. And again, the soft and medium compounds will be brought to the Monza circuit. And Monza, very high-speed circuit, faster if you wish than Spa. And if there's similar temperatures, do you think there needs to be some kind of thing that needs to happen? Perhaps change the compounds, even bring on the hard tyres instead of the softs?
Yeah, either that, which you would hope Pirelli would be able to bring forward, get these different compounds on the road to Monza in time. Either that, or the now what you would describe as antiquated concept of installing temporary chicanes, as we've seen in the days of yesteryear, when there have been such concerns, not least 10 years ago at Indianapolis.
Yes, and this sort of just brings back the whole argument about Pirelli being blamed for what the Formula One, the commercial rights holder, and the FIA dictate for what they want in a tyre. Perhaps the regulations need to change, and as you were saying before, Michelin knocking on the door at perhaps entering the sport in 2017 as a tyre supplier. Do you think, in light of this, perhaps the regulations should change?
Certainly, it's quite a consider all the other events which we've discussed off the top, the tragedies which have occurred. It's something which can't be summarily dismissed. It's one they really, again, it's the same with canopies. It just needs to be thoroughly assessed in time for the new regulations which are due in probably 2017, but perhaps 2018 if they all decide there's not enough time to get them all through. Then in line with that, the tyre regulations do need to be looked at quite stringently.
Indeed, but this is the first time, as you said, for a while we haven't had any sort of blowouts or this sort of thing happen. So this is the first time in a while that something has happened, and we'll just look to Monza now to see if there is a repeat or not. But if there isn't, then perhaps we won't be discussing this for much longer.
Yeah, well, it's the kind of issue, I guess, if it's a once-off occurrence, it tends to fade away quite quickly. But if we do get a rapid follow-up, say Monza in 2 weeks' time, then you can bet every dollar it will be the most prevalent issue dominating the category.
Indeed. So moving it on now to Enstone, the Lotus F1 team and their future, which is been thrown into doubt this weekend with the allegations from their former test driver, Charles Pic, who's obtained a court order to effectively impound the team's cars because he wasn't given sufficient time in the car last year to fulfill his role as a test driver. And also the Renault takeover, potentially. We've alluded to this in the past couple of weeks in our silly season special as well. Let's get into the nitty-gritty of it then, I guess. And before we go there, I have written a piece regarding this, which I'll put the link in the description for you to read at your own leisure. But all right, Baden, how would we feel about Renault coming over back into Enstone?
I don't know if we've said it so expressly in previous podcasts, but I'm all for it personally. Any more manufacturers, I think it's a sentiment you would have to share with me, unless I'm very much mistaken, to quote the great Murray Walker. But really, F1 sorely needs another one of these up the front, along with Mercedes and Ferrari, just bringing a team to the forefront of the action again. And clearly, the Tyres, which we have seen already, Renault for many years throughout the 2000s, essentially were the factory outfit there at Enstone. So the tie-up, as you've mentioned to me in passing in recent weeks, it's like the shoe that would fit right into the foot sole, which would fit straight into the shoe. Everyone would know each other there, and you'd see a seamless transition back to being run by the French marque.
And Enstone stalwart Alan Permet, now the Lotus trackside operations manager, said that he would welcome Renault with open arms if they do look to come back in. And that just shows, I guess, the team was still passionate about what they do, and the drivers as well, and Grosjean, Maldonado, what have you. They just want to get back to the front, and it has been quite a struggle for this team in particular in the last couple of years. We detailed how in 2013 they had the financial woes with their driver Kimi Räikkönen not being paid, and then this mysterious quantum or infinity group, as it were, potentially coming in to save the team, and that didn't come to fruition. So. And Permain also said that this year has been the worst for them in terms of finances. So is Lotus putting all their bets on Renault coming to save the day?
It's creeping towards that point, and obviously it is quite poignant, as we mentioned earlier on, with that podium that they've just achieved. It's a bit of a come down to this very murky status that they had post Sunday, when the cars were, all the assets were essentially impounded. Whether we do see them for the balance of the season, but it's hedging towards the view that unless Renault does reacquire the Enstone outfit there, that who knows whether we're going to be seeing them back on the grid come next March, April.
But perhaps could these this big mess of financial and legal woes that surround Enstone, could that potentially throw Renault off from reacquiring it? We heard also over the weekend that Force India are being talked to as well. Dr. Vijay Mallya, the team principal, has made it no secret that he's met twice this season with Alain Prost, the ambassador to Renault, and it wasn't a social call. They were discussing a majority acquisition, and as it were, of his team based in Silverstone. So it seems that Renault are not just putting all their eggs into the Enstone basket; they're looking at other operations as well.
Well, naturally, you have to do your due diligence, as they would call it, to just check all the options, cover the bases, and it really would be a surprise if this left field notion of a Force India buyout did come to fruition. It's just so much logic in that the Enstone acquisition there. So if it does happen, you never can say never in Formula One. Strange things do occur that no one has seen coming, but unless it was really drastically bad for Renault, and there's just no way that they could see that they could, or Lotus, I should say, formerly Renault, they could salvage the woes which they're currently enduring, then really you'd have to say that it's going to be Renault at Enstone next season.
Indeed, and things are that dire for Lotus at the moment, or Enstone, that we've heard that they're actually holding back their payments to their creditors, which are overdue, until Renault perhaps takes them over and perhaps they do it for them. But regardless, some factors we've also got to consider. The CEO of Lotus, Matthew Carter, said back at the Malaysian Grand Prix that they have a long-term deal with their new powertrain supplier in Mercedes-Benz, and they are looking to honour that. But if Renault are looking to get back in, then perhaps Mercedes are going to be turfed after one season. And then we look at Red Bull Racing as well, who are also a factor in this. That the messy divorce between them and Renault could mean that Renault might want to come back as early as 2016. So where would that leave Red Bull? Well, Red Bull could perhaps take up Lotus's deal with Mercedes-Benz, and Toto Wolff, the team boss of Mercedes AMG, was quizzed about this over the weekend, and he didn't deny that it was possible, and perhaps they are starting discussions over there between Brixworth and Milton Keynes.
Yes, well, it would be logical for Red Bull to expedite their divorce, as you would describe it, from Renault. 2016 was always looming as that final season, but if Renault is back most immediately in this factory capacity in time for next season, then there's really no reason for Red Bull to hang around for 1 year in this customer supply. They might as well just move on and cut their losses, even if it means it's a later integration with their RB12 chassis, what they can do with it. And with Mercedes, we've already seen that they are the class of the field, so surely Red Bull wouldn't be losing much at all if they did make this switch, as inconceivable as it had been only a couple of weeks ago.
And we have heard that Red Bull and Christian Horner and all the stakeholders, what have you, are trying to look for some early exit clauses in the contract with Renault, which is, as you said, until the end of next year. But perhaps we could see some changes in the coming weeks, but watch this space certainly. And as I said, there's an article that I've written regarding how it would be a logical fit for Renault to take over Enstone, and that'll be posted in the description below, so please be sure to check that out. But moving on to this week's segment of Nostalgia Straight, and let's talk about Tyres, F1 and the laws of limits. Pirelli, as we were discussing before, are no stranger to these sort of dramas, and what better to go back through their tenure and look at some of the incidents that they've had. So can you enlighten us a little bit about what's happened through their...
Well, pretty much coming back to 2011 when they replaced Bridgestone as the control supplier of the category. We saw instantly how radical the concept had been. It was the remit which was passed down from Bernie Ecclestone essentially to Pirelli, that they must design a tyre that was based, I believe, around the 2010 Canadian Grand Prix, which, if you cast your minds back, was quite a spectacular one. There was a rapid degradation of the tyres, and it was thus that Pirelli re-entered the sport, and these tyres, essentially for the first 2.5-3 seasons, were the compound structure, and that this all culminated in the 2013 campaign. There were just numerous instances of cars almost halfway through their first lap on a set of tyres, they'd just be completely destroyed, if not suffering spectacular punctures, highlighted by that Silverstone weekend when there was the remarks essentially that it was like bullets being fired at the drivers, like coming out of a missile down that the Cop Straight. Fernando Alonso, for one, was extremely lucky to have come away without any kind of injury inflicted, amongst others, that is.
And also we look at talking about the infamous 2013 season and how there was one team in particular that really pushed for a compound change, and it was arguable that may have helped them in the championship get away from their rivals, and who other than Red Bull Racing it was.
And that didn't benefit them at all. We saw Sebastian Vettel 9 consecutive victories in that back half of the campaign, so they sure know how to pick their fights, and that one essentially terminated what was, up till that, not just Silverstone, but through all the traditional summer break, a very compelling championship. We had seen Fernando Alonso leading in the early stages, and again Lotus through Kimi Raikkonen, and then eventually Romain Grosjean. They were really starting to take the battle up to Red Bull.
And it just goes to show how there are some teams who, do a lot of work on their chassis in terms of maintaining the tyres and making their chassis work with the tyres. Lotus was probably the kindest chassis on the tyres that season, and Ferrari to an extent as well were the same. But what about the future now in terms of tyre manufacturers? If we looked at Michelin before, they were in the sport, of course, until the infamous Indygate that occurred in 2005, was it?
Yeah, well, that precipitated their exit from the sport. A year later, they really the hatred which came out as a result of that was pretty much too much to handle from that point onwards, and it would be remiss not to bring that up in light of this tyre debate. Of course, 10 years ago it was now, we only had 6 starters at that Indianapolis Grand Prix. All 16 Michelin runners pulled out on that installation lap, and the damage which this inflicted upon not just the Formula One, but mostly in America. It took a long time for the entire relationship to recover there.
Indeed, and we've discussed this many times before as well, regarding perhaps another tyre war returning, and we've both said that it would be great for the sport in terms of show and spectacle that we have a tyre war, and we just echoing the same thing again. Michelin versus Pirelli, would that be something that we'd be looking forward to see?
There's always the cynic who says, the cost factor will just escalate out of proportion, but Formula One, there's always going to be a cost factor, and if this is something which improves the quality of racing, then what's a bit of extra money that's poured in to make this happen? Michelin, clearly that they're keen. They keep saying that they want to introduce these 18-inch rims and the like, which are used in their endurance capacity in the sports cars and what have you. Of course, they're returning to a MotoGP from this season, whether this would preclude them from a return to F1. But Pirelli and Michelin, if they could really work, obviously as competitors, but in tandem to provide, obviously, alternatives to the grid, I think this would be a good thing for F1.
And I wonder how, if this current debate over the blowouts that occurred over the weekend, I wonder how if this could be used as leverage, in a sense, over Pirelli, and perhaps draw Michelin's attention as to perhaps designing a tyre that might be more suited to F1.
Yeah, well, if Michelin do come in and adopt their philosophy of a long-lasting tyre, the events of the Belgian Grand Prix certainly haven't harmed their prospects.
But then again, as I said before, it depends on what the commercial rights holder and the sport wants, not what the drivers want, because that's why Pirelli's tyres only last a third of the race, or 30% or 40% of the race, not the entire race like the old Bridgestones did. So, as much as we debate about it, it's it's no use when ultimately the decision lies with someone else regarding what.
Someone such as Bernie Eccleston, who's quite happy with the income that he earns through his masters, you could call it, with the trackside signage there. It's worth a pretty penny, and you can see why he clearly, even if Pirelli do have these big flashpoint moments where things do go wrong, he'd be very reluctant to let that commercial package go unless Michelin came to the table with a similarly lucrative offer.
Yeah, and that's something we're going to look forward to in the future, of course, see if this Michelin deal comes afloat. But I don't know about you, Baden, but I think that's about it for this week. We've covered pretty much everything we've wanted to get through, and as we said, next week we'll be back with the Italian Grand Prix preview. It's a special race for many, and indeed for Ferrari. Having not won there for quite some time now, and with a winning car under their belt, perhaps they can get back on the top step.
Well, that'd be something. We saw Michael Schumacher in 1996, his first race in the infamous red colours. He claimed victory at Monza. 2010, Fernando Alonso, his first campaign for Ferrari. What a jubilant day that was for him. It was the one which really propelled him right back into that title contention. And now Sebastian Vettel, who is really being decreed as the next version of Michael Schumacher. And if he could pull off something out of the hat there, that would be quite something, I'd say. And who knows how much more this would resonate with the ever-loyal Tifosi.
Indeed. So, as we said, that's pretty much it for today's edition. Thank you for joining me, Jawad and Baden, and we'll see you guys next week. Ciao.
Ciao.